again, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome here again to the Frontier Culture Museum. Happy 4th of July. So what we're going to be talking about now is a little bit about the culture and music coming out of West Africa with my friend Jean-Claude here. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the international slave trade and how it developed both abroad and here in the United States. All right, Jean-Claude.
Music in West Africa. I have different drums here. Traditionally, music was the heartbeat, the soul in most of the African community. They play drums to celebrate. They play drums to moon. They play drums to communicate. So let me give the name of these drums. First of all, this is a djembe, the most well-known African drum in the world. It has goat skin on the top, and when you play the djembe, you use your hands. And these, what they call the dunduns, it's a family of dunguba, kenkeni, and sangaba. So drums, they play an important role in African life, including the physical, emotional, and spiritual. I'm gonna play some of this and hear how it sounds. When you play the drums, people can dance, and when they get a dance move, you get your dance move from your daily activities. Here it is. This is the djembe, as I say, and when you play the djembe, pretty much leading the drumming here. Instrument like the banjo. The banjo comes from West Africa. They shake the shaker here. They have the bells. They play different instruments. So keep in mind the music you hear, you feel, you can march into it. That's gonna tell that European beat or style, and the music you hear, you can dance into it. That's West African beat. So now I'm going to pass to my friend Mark to talk about the international slave trade.
All right. So here at the Frontier Culture Museum, what we're really trying to depict is a group of people called the Igbo. The Igbo would be living in what we would consider modern-day Nigeria, just a little bit away from the coastlines into what we would think of as the rainforested belt there. The Igbo were one of many different people in West Africa that were afflicted because of the slave trade. So it starts really in the 1400s when Europeans are starting to try to sail to China and India to open up trade routes. And the Portuguese initially are sailing around the coast of Africa, and while they're there, they're setting up trade ports and they're setting up resupply bases for their ships. After the discovery of the New World, with Columbus's sailing across and reporting it back to Europe, and them setting up colonies in the New World, the demand for labor began to increase. And Spain and Portugal, the way they ended up, one of the many ways they ended up fulfilling that labor shortage was with the slave trade. Now, there was already a local slave trade going on in West Africa, but it's very different than what we think of when we talk about chattel slavery here in the New World. Prisoners of war, people who had debts to pay, and criminals generally would be enslaved, possibly just for a term, for a particular time. And then after that, they would again be freed. Now, the Europeans start trading into West Africa, mostly trading guns, gunpowder, and European woolens and clothing goods. And they're looking for not just slaves, but also gold and ivory, and other exotic goods, maybe like Cuba cloth. So that trade is beginning to go on. Now, for the English, the arrival of the first Africans is going to happen in 1619. It's going to be one of these Portuguese and Spanish ships bound for, in this case, Mexico. If you ever really want to know how little the folks of the time period really understood the moral problems with slavery, the name of the slave ship was the St. John the Baptist. It'd be like naming your slave ship the Freedom or the Liberty. So the ship is on its way to the New World when it's attacked by privateers, which are government-sponsored pirates, by the English and the Dutch. The ship is captured, and of course, pirates and privateers are looking for that gold or ivory to take. They try to get down into the cargo, and they start taking Africans off of the ships. And in the course of all this, the crew of the St. John the Baptist are able to escape. We know this part of the story because they report the pirate attack. The rest of the story we get from documentation from the Virginia colonists. Having 20 and odd extra Africans now on board and no real food to feed them, they go to the nearest friendly town, which ends up being Jamestown, Virginia. They drop off the Africans, and we don't really know what happens to them at that point. The slave laws are in a kind of flux in the period. It's illegal to own slaves in England at that moment. And as a result, what is likely happening is that they're probably being indentured for the cost of the food and supplies that the privateers ended up taking. But again, the details are very fuzzy on that. We know that some of these Africans were later on paid in land, just like the indentured servants here in the Virginias. But because they were coming from Angola specifically for this group, they'd already been exposed to growing the cash crop here in Virginia, which was tobacco, and living in a warmer climate, so they didn't die from the heat as much as the English colonists were suffering from. So the English colony asked for more African indentures. And of course, there are no African indentures in England. So they go to Africa, they buy slaves. Because slavery was against the law, they were freed and indentured in the exact same breath. And the terms of contract were extended, where you start seeing 14-year contracts as opposed to the standard 7 years. And then you'll start seeing 30-year contracts, and then you'll see 50-year contracts. And by the time you get to about the 1650s, you'll actually start seeing indentured for life as the contracts. By the 1660s, Virginia will pass the first slave laws, and this is where things really change here for the colony. If you were indentured for life, you were now made a slave. And this is the part that changes it. If your mother was a slave, you too would then become a slave. And that's what creates that perpetual and never-ending institution of slavery that becomes chattel slavery. So that's a little bit about how it's developed up to this point. Jean-Claude, can you tell us a little bit about what it was actually like back in West Africa with all this?
So here you are, 300 years ago, long time ago. You think of these people living in a tropical rainforest. They have their homes, you have a family, you have your life, you do the farming, and the main crop here were the yams. So now imagine you send your kids down to the river to collect water, or your boys to get firewood, and by surprise, be taken, and you never see your kid anymore. So now imagine capturing a bunch of people now. Most of the time they're gonna walk these people, the African, captured, during the night. One reason was, it's hot in West Africa. During the night, it's cool, and you can walk miles and miles, And the second reason was, most to confuse them. If you happen to escape, you will hard to recognize, how to get home. So now, once taken, they're gonna take these people on the bank of the ocean. They're gonna park these people in a ship. So they're gonna cross the ocean, which is gonna take weeks, months. Now imagine you've been taken from your homeland. You don't know why you've been taken, and you don't know where you're going. Can you feel this pain of these people? Some of them didn't make it to the New World because they were, either overwhelmed. Some they jump off the ship, they commit suicide, they die that way. So once you get to the New World, and you'll be sold. So now, keep in mind, when I say captured, that we put shackles on them, that we're gonna chain them up, sometimes walk in the coffin. So now, keep in mind, when we talk about these people coming over here, we don't forget the contribution of these people to America. When we talk about the food we eat today from Africa, like the okra, the black eyed peas, the cowpeas, melon, even chicken like the guinea hens. When we talk about music, beside the drums, remember the banjo coming from West Africa.
Excellent. So, that's a little bit about how it's taking place in Africa. So let's talk about how it continues to develop here in the colonies. So, for Virginia, the cash crop, as I mentioned, was tobacco. And about 40% of all the enslaved Africans that came to the colony of Virginia were Igbo. Now, give it a generation or two after the first slave laws are passed, and it starts to become that the only slaves that the English really have any interaction with were sub-Saharan African slaves. And that's when you start seeing some of those more punitive laws start coming onto the books. You start seeing laws such as slaves cannot meet in groups larger than 3. Slaves cannot leave their property that they're attached to without the written consent of their owner. Or that slaves cannot be taught to read and write. Another one of those laws in that same vein was actually about the drums. They ended up banning the drums for a number of reasons, but in large part it was because in the European traditions, drums are military. They're mostly used in concerts for marching and things of that nature. And the cultural disconnect between how they're being used in Africa led the European slave owners to be afraid of the Africans communicating and rallying behind that music. So a lot of these drums were banned, and while they were still sometimes used in secret, they were actually banned here in most of the colonies. Now, by the time we make it to what we're talking about today, during the generation of the Founding Fathers, after the American Revolution, they actually codified about what a slave was. And in the Constitution, they write that a slave is about 3/5 of a person. If you give it a few more generations, by the time of the Civil War, it's not even that anymore, really. The Civil War ended the institution of slavery, but the racism that that institution had created continues to be a legacy we have to deal with even today. So at this time, folks, thank you for listening to us talk. We're going to take some questions at this time.
For the first generation of indentured Africans that came to Virginia, was it mostly men, women, children, or a mix of all 3?
So the first generation of Africans coming over here is going to be generally a bigger mix. As time goes on, you're going to see that the colonies, depending on their needs, will either prioritize men or women. For the Virginias, eventually it's going to come to the point that while the importation of slaves will continue, women get prized quite a bit for being able to help grow the population kind of naturally. So the answer is it depends on when we're talking about for first generation arrivals in the colony, because we're trying to cover, at this point, more than a 100-year span.
Why were the slave owners afraid of drums, and that led to them being banned?
Well, you keep in mind here, as I mentioned earlier, drumming was a way of communicating. And these people, they communicate between themselves. And that's one of the things, the Europeans were afraid of these people. Yet, on the other hand, the Europeans, they want to just, have these people from Africa forget about their culture.
Why were the Igbo captured and enslaved much more frequently than other West Africans?
The Igbo end up being a bit susceptible to being captured by slavery. Because they live in the rainforest, communications between different villages and different towns is a lot more difficult, and because of a lot of times the environment. They have a fairly diffuse sort of government. So a lot of power rests in the town and in the village. And once they get outside of, they've been captured and really outside of the influence of that one small town or village, there's not a whole lot of other apparatus to be able to stop raiding parties into the region. And unfortunately for the Igbo, that left them susceptible to being captured pretty much through the entire period. Well, folks, I want to thank you all for joining us today again on this 4th of July, for joining me and Jean-Claude here at the Frontier Culture Museum. Folks, if you would go down below, there's a link. If you feel that we're doing a good job, please feel free to donate to us so that we can bring more programming like this to you, both here and please come visit us here at the museum, and we'd be happy to talk with you all. Enjoy the rest of your day.